Hello, I'm Nathan Snyder. I'm here at the Special Events Center at Boise State, and today I'm going to be demonstrating the basics of analog synthesis for music. Today I will be demonstrating on a Behringer Poly D, and I'll be using a PV amplifier, no other special effects, and the microphone that we'll be using so that you can hear the amplifier is a Shure SM57. Again, no other special effects, just so that you can hear kind of the plain sounds of this system. And with that, let's go to the synthesizer. So this is the Behringer Poly D. It's principally inspired by the Moog, Mini Moog Model D. However, it has a few differences, primarily an extra oscillator and the ability to play in unison mode, which is actually paraphonic mode and poly mode, and it has a lovely chorus and distortion section over on this side, not to mention a really cool little sequencer. But for today, we're going to focus on the basics. And the basics of any analog synthesizer start with the oscillator. So an oscillator is a device that periodically changes state. And in the case of music, what we're talking about is a device that changes the voltage of an electronic signal up and down. And it does it at a frequency that we can hear in our ears. So for example, if we were playing middle A, that oscillator is turning on and off or changing its voltage state 440 times a second. Again, middle A right here. And the only thing you're hearing when I'm depressing that note is this one oscillator playing at middle A, 440 times a second. This particular synthesizer's oscillator can produce a triangle wave, and then we'd see the oscillator with a triangle wave. It can produce a modified triangle, which gives that sound. It produces a ramp. It can produce a square wave. A square wave with a shortened duty cycle, which means the square part that's in the positive domain is less than the part that's in the negative domain. And you can take a look at the oscillator here, or the oscilloscope here. And then if we reduce the duty cycle one more time, we get this kind of sound. We're changing the output or the oscillator, modifying it by modifying its waveform with this switch here. One other thing that we can modify this oscillator with, besides being able to change its waveform, I can change this note, which is 440 now, down to 220, 440, 880, another octave up, and another octave up. So with this one oscillator, turning it on and off, I can get all of these sounds. I've been pretending that we've been using only the oscillator, but in fact we've been using two things so far that are common to every analog synthesizer. They're the oscillator, and in this case, the voltage-controlled amplifier. The voltage-controlled amplifier is on this synthesizer called the loudness contour. And right now it's set up to have an instantaneous attack, a zero decay, and zero sustain. What that means is when I hit a note, it instantly comes up to full volume, holds at the full volume, and then when I let go, it releases instantaneously. If I were to change the attack, say like this, now when I depress the note, it takes a little while for it to come up to full volume. If I increase the attack time, it's even slower. And if I increase it still, it takes longer and longer to come up to full volume. This is a voltage-controlled amplifier. The amplifier is controlling the volume of the signal coming from the oscillator. The next piece is the sustain. I'm going to reduce the attack to 0 again. And now, I'm sorry, the next part, not sustain, make sure I get this right, is the decay. After I initially depress the note, the decay will drop the volume. Since my sustain is at 0, it drops it all the way to 0. I can shorten this and get kind of a clicky, percussive sound. If, however, I add some sustain back, I can get a sound that's similar to a guitar sound, where there's an initial pluck and then some sustain. So that is a very basic voltage-controlled amplifier, and again, on the Moog synthesizers in this Moog copy, it's called a loudness contour. It is the contour of the volume shape. That's where the term comes from. On more complex voltage-controlled amplifiers, you have an attack, sustain, decay, and release. Something different on this particular old design is that instead of a release, we have another decay. And if we turn this on, it has an additional release after I let go. It's a predetermined fixed amount. Because this was one of the very first synthesizers to come around, this is Bob Moog's design, and it just kind of is what it is. If you know how to play it, it's a lot of fun, but most synthesizers have what we call an ADSR for voltage-controlled amplifier. That's attack, decay, sustain, and release. And my earpiece keeps coming out. Interesting thing about the ADSR is it isn't just for a voltage-controlled amplifier. It's just called an ADSR unit. That is, it's a contour control, or what's also called an envelope generator, EG for short on many synthesizers. The envelope generator can be applied, in this case, to the voltage-controlled amplifier, but it can also be applied to things like the filter. And let's go take a look at the filter now. If we take a look at this section here, it's called filter, and you'll notice that it does have the attack, decay, and sustain on it. I have these kind of zeroed out so they're not affecting it at all. It's just as soon as I depress a key, the filter is wide open, and then the filter is not affecting the signal. But let's listen to the filter first. It has three main controls, but there's two that are the most important. That is the cutoff frequency and the emphasis. The cutoff frequency is like a tone knob on a car stereo. It brightens or dims the signal. And in fact, with it wide open, it's basically letting the original signal off the oscillator pass all the way through. A good example is to go to the square wave and then to sweep it down. And it mutes the square wave in a way. There's still volume there, but now it has a dimmer sound. What's fundamentally happening when you smooth out a square wave to a sine wave using a filter is we're taking out the harmonics of the square wave and removing some of the harmonic content of the oscillation. The removing of the harmonic content is subtracting the harmonic content from the raw complex oscillation. That is fundamentally why this process is called subtractive synthesis. You start with a complicated wave and reduce or remove the harmonics to get simple waves. And in this way, we're doing wave shaping. If we play this note, we can sweep this filter, but we can change the quality of the filter. On this filter section, the Q, or the quality, is called emphasis. As we increase this, it narrows the band of frequencies that are affected by the cutoff frequency. And we get this kind of amazing sweeping sound, especially if we're using a square wave oscillator. And as we continue to increase the emphasis, or the Q, this particular filter starts to self-oscillate. You hear that note? Self-oscillation is one of the things that makes the traditional Moog design filter so desirable for synth players. It fundamentally gives you yet another oscillator you have control of. A very, very cool thing. There are, of course, more things on this filter section, and again, let's now apply the attack and decay and sustain. And I have to dial in the amount of contour here. And now you can see this one oscillator with the attack applied to the filter instead of the volume creates this kind of brassy resonant sound, as if it's a brass instrument where the lips in the mouthpiece are starting to roll into it and get that big sound. It's a little slow. A little faster. A little faster. and we get kind of a brass. It's a bit of a wet, brassy sound, as if they're spitting in the horn. So I'll take some of the emphasis out. Now, using this subtractive synthesis method, start to create the kind of sounds that we're used to hearing. Of course, we're not limited to creating brass sounds and guitar sounds. We can make any kind of sound we want using these instruments. So far we've talked about the oscillator, the voltage-controlled amplifier, the envelope generator, and now the filter. And that's pretty much what you need for a basic synthesizer. But you have noticed there's a whole bunch of extra knobs on this synthesizer. We have just the top part here, and then this section, and we haven't used any of the other knobs yet. So what are all the rest of the knobs? So far we've been using one oscillator, and you can see right away there's a difference between this oscillator on top and the rest. That's because these have a pitch control. Well, this one does too, it's just that it happens to be the master pitch control right here. So I can tune this oscillator here. Now, right now, you're not hearing these other oscillators because they're turned off. There's a mixer section right here. And in fact, it's labeled mixer. And this mixes our different oscillators together. I have the volumes turned up, but I have them turned off. Only the one oscillator is on. So let's hear what it sounds like when I start turning on other oscillators. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the filter so that we can really hear it. And you'll notice I can retune the second oscillator. But I've got the second oscillator in sine wave, so I'll switch that up into square wave. And now we've got a really fat sound. Now in this case, we've left the domain of subtractive synthesis and gone into the domain of additive synthesis. We don't typically think of these synthesizers as additive synthesizers, but they in fact are. When you have multiple oscillators combining to create more complex tones, that's an additive synthesizer. A classic example of an additive synthesizer is an organ, like a Hammond organ, where you have drawbars and you create the sounds by adding different oscillators to create the overall tone. Here, I've got two oscillators creating a more complex tone than the original either oscillator could do on their own. So I've got this cool sound, but I can add to it. I dial in the same square wave at oscillator 3, and it's at the same note. If I turn oscillator 2 off, we can tune it up, and it's at the same note as oscillator 1, but I'm going to move it an octave up. Add back in oscillator 2, and now I'm getting an even bigger, richer sound. But I still have yet one more oscillator, oscillator 4. I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to move it an octave down to give it a really big, fat sound. Now listen to this. Big, fat sound. So we have a subtractive synthesizer, and we're engaged in additive synthesis by stacking up oscillators. Pretty cool, right? So now we're going to start a discussion about polyphony, paraphony, and monophonic synthesis. So far, we've done monophonic synthesis. That is a synthesizer that can play one note at a time. That one note may constitute many oscillators, but it is one note at a time. A polyphonic synthesizer plays more than one note at a time. And we call those individual, the ability to play notes, its voices. So a 4-voice polyphonic synthesizer can play 4 distinct notes at a time. This particular synthesizer gives us the ability to move from a monophonic mode to a polyphonic mode, which means each one of these 4 oscillators will be assigned a key. Now, of course, because I've retuned this, I'm all out of whack, so I'm going to retune real fast. Sorry about that. So, again, here's that demonstration. Four voices. What happens if I play another note? the first note that was played in the sequence gets dropped off and the next note gets added. Now that's a peculiarity of this particular synthesizer and its build. It's not true of all polyphonic synthesizers. Some polyphonic synthesizers just won't add an additional note. Some will do this, and some will maybe have some other kind of scenario. If I now switch it from poly back to mono, I'm gonna hope it's tuned up better than this. Now, all four of those oscillators are stacked up on this one note. What happens if I play a second note? It just goes to the second note and drops the first one. This actually can be a pretty cool effect if you know how to play it. But this synthesizer has something that I think is, I don't know if it's very new. They call it unison mode on this synthesizer, but I've got some synthesizers from the late 70s, early 80s that have unison mode, and all that means is it stacks up multiple notes and you play it kind of like a chord of notes up on a single note. This one's unison mode, I think, is more commonly called paraphonic mode, which means if we switch it to paraphonic mode, what they call unison mode, if I play one note, it plays all four oscillators with the one note. If I play two notes, then two of the oscillators goes to one note and two of the oscillators go to the other note. Next mark, camera 7. And if I play four notes, one oscillator goes to the first note, one oscillator goes to the second, and so on. What this means is, if I play a chord, I've got polyphony, but if I go to a solo, I've got monophonic. Which means I get a fat solo, but I've also got polyphonic sound. I don't know of very many synthesizers that sound like this. In fact, I think this is a great synthesizer with this paraphonic mode to solo with, and then to vamp and comp in the background, just in this paraphonic mode. And then there's even more exotic things you can do with it. For example, if I retune the oscillator, now when I play chords, if I just barely gliss the chord or arpeggiate the chord very quickly and hold in different directions, I get a chaotic output. I haven't learned to play this technique musically yet, but I see a lot of potential to use this particular technique musically to create a kind of randomness in music that might be really advantageous for someone to play a solo on top of. For a live performance, I've seen very few things that are as cool as this. So there we've talked about the oscillator, the voltage-controlled amplifier, the filter, and the contour filters, also known as the envelope generators, polyphony, monophonic, and paraphonic options on this synthesizer. Now, some extra bells and whistles. The glide function. We turn it on here. For this mode, I'm going to do it in mono. And what this does is slides from one note to the next. The glide speed right now is very quick. I'm going to decrease the glide speed. And you may notice a kind of Keith Emerson solo sound, typical of if you listen to the album Tarkus by Emerson, like Palmer, for example. Pretty cool, huh? And you can change the speed while you're performing. For a very low speed, I'm sorry, it's right here. Then hold this note, increase it. For dramatic end of solo. Then we also have other kinds of modulation. Modulation is functionally anything that modifies the sound. In a way, the filter is a kind of modulator. But we tend to think of modulation as an oscillatory modulation, which is why we have the mod wheel. We can assign the mod wheel to control certain parts of a filter on some synthesizers, but in this case, our modulation wheel here is mapped to, let me turn the glide off. It's not mapped to anything at the moment, so we don't hear it, but if I go to the contour, it has its own low-frequency oscillator, yet another oscillator on the synthesizer. I control the speed here, and there is a filter oscillation. But if that weren't enough, we can actually modulate use the filter on the tone. Where is the pitch oscillation? Here it is. Pretty cool, right? Then there's also pitch. So modulation on the filter, modulation on the low frequency oscillation, or on the oscillators, and pitch bending. But there's more. There's noise. Noise. Why would you add noise? Adding noise in subtractive synthesis makes tones even more complex. We have a noise generator. If I turn off all the oscillators and turn on just the noise, this one has two types of noise: white noise, which you've probably heard of before, and pink noise. Pink noise and white noise are both versions of noise. It's just that if you take a look, and here we're going to insert an over-shoulder shot of the oscilloscope and depress white noise and pink noise. White noise is frequency flat across the spectrum. That is, it's random energy introduced as audio, and the energy is spread equally across the spectrum that we can hear in. Pink noise adds a bit of bass to it. And then it would show the curve on the bass in the oscilloscope in the shot. If we have noise, we can affect it with the filter. It's a pretty nice surf sound, isn't it? If we change the cue or the emphasis, we can get kind of a wind sound. And high desert wind by using a white noise to start. And then if we add that in with an oscillator, increase the amount of contour, and it becomes a kind of attack sound. As if a snare drum is playing on the exact attack of each note. But there's more. Keyboard control or keyboard tracking means that the effects of the filter can track with the keyboard. That is, here, the filter is applied equally across the entire length of the keyboard. But if we increase the keyboard control or the keyboard tracking, it's more prominent at the bottom and less prominent at the top. And maximum means the filter is most heavily influenced at the bottom, deep filtration, and little filtration on the top. This means that high notes are less filtered and low notes are more filtered, and creates a lower tone for low notes and a brighter, crisper tone for high notes, which is typically representative on a lot of instruments, and it has a very pleasing sound to the ear. So that's the basics of subtractive synthesis. This is the kind of thing you're going to find on most little analog synthesizers. A couple oscillators, some voltage-controlled amplifier, some voltage-controlled filter, and an envelope generator, some basic modulation with a mod wheel and a low-frequency oscillator, pitch shifting, and maybe glissando or portamento. This synthesizer, however, has even more things on it, like a chorus function, distortion, an onboard sequencer, and a handful of other things that are used for deeper kinds of modulation. Let's wrap up. So that's all there is for this, and I hope you enjoyed this very brief demonstration on subtractive synthesis for analog synthesizers. Thank you, and have a nice whatever day, evening. See you next time on the interwebs, and fade to black.